Well, last week we began our new series about the Bible. We attempted to answer this question about the Bible. What is it? What is the Bible? And here it was our basic answer. This is kind of the basic summary of what we came up with. The Bible is a library of ancient documents that together tell the story of God's people. It's also God's primary way of speaking to us, teaching us about Himself and about His plan for us. You see, as we read about the story of God's people, we learn right along with them who God is and what He wants for us. The story culminates in the arrival of Jesus, who gave us the best and most complete revelation of who God is and what His plan is. But another question frequently arises about the Bible, especially in this day and age. Can we trust it? Can we trust the Bible? That is to say, how do we know that the Bible accurately tells the story of God's people and their experiences with it? How do we know that the Bible accurately relays to us the teachings and the ministry of Jesus, as well as the experiences of His early followers? Now, some of you, upon hearing this question about the Bible, probably thought, well, of course we can trust it. Why would you ask such a question? But I'm willing to also bet that many of you have asked this question yourselves. If you're in the first group, consider this an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper, to inspect the things you're relying upon. It's an opportunity to dig deeper without taking things at face value. Now, here in the second group who've asked this question before, I'm hoping to give you a satisfactory answer. But whichever group you're in, I hope that you leave this place with your faith strengthened and a greater trust and reliability in the Bible. Well, let's break down the question a little bit. Can we trust it is kind of a complicated question, because when we ask if the Bible is trustworthy, what we really mean is one of or both of the following questions. First of all, do the original texts that the Bible is drawn from accurately communicate what really happened in history? And then the other question we ask is, do the copies we have today accurately represent the original text? We have copies of copies of copies. How do we know that the copy we have today accurately reflects the original? Well, in answering these questions, we actually have to deal with the Old and the New Testament separately, because they came together separately, as you found out last week. Now, unfortunately, we really don't have a whole lot of information on the Old Testament that would help us answer these questions. What we do know is that the Old Testament we have today hasn't changed since the time of Jesus. In the 1940s, scrolls dating back to the 1st century were discovered in the Qumran caves near the Dead Sea. These became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, and among them were copies of all but one of the Old Testament's books. This means that the Old Testament we read today has remained unchanged for 2,000 years. Now, on the other hand, we can say quite a bit more about the New Testament. That's for two reasons. First, the New Testament was written more recently in history. And second, the institution responsible for preserving the New Testament is still around today, the church. So for a moment, let's focus on answering these questions about the New Testament. So, do the original texts of the New Testament accurately communicated what happened? Well, let's start by looking at one specific book of the New Testament, the Gospel of Luke. Luke starts this biography of Jesus like this. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the Word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. Now, Luke was not an eyewitness to the life of Jesus, but he was a known traveling companion of Paul. In fact, Luke wrote a sequel to his gospel, the book of Acts. The book of Acts details Paul's ministry and the ministries of the early Christian leaders. himself was not an eyewitness, he had contact with a lot of people who were. These are those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the Word. And in preparation for writing his gospel, Luke says that he carefully investigated everything from the beginning. Scholars say that some of Luke's source material was taken from the Gospel of Mark and also from a lost document that collected the teachings of Jesus. They say that Matthew did much the same thing with his gospel. So we're already seeing that Luke did his homework. He interviewed eyewitnesses and referred to even earlier accounts of Jesus' ministry. Some of Paul's own comments about Luke indicate that he was a physician. He was a doctor, so it should come as no surprise to us that Luke was very systematic with his research. Now, a lot of critics say that by the time Luke got around to writing the events about the events of Jesus' ministry, the stories of Jesus had become inflated or exaggerated. Well, let's put this in perspective. You might have a little trouble with this visual, but hopefully you find it helpful. Jesus' ministry lasted from AD 28 to AD 30. Now, while some scholars date Luke's gospel to the 80s, there's significant evidence that Luke was actually written in the early 60s. Either way, there's a 30 to 50-year gap between the writings of Luke's gospel and the events it describes. Let's put that in perspective, though. As New Testament professor Craig Blomberg points out, the two earliest biographies of Alexander the Great were written more than 400 years after his death, and historians consider them to be generally trustworthy. So if ancient historians can write reasonably accurate biographies of Alexander the Great 400 years after he died, surely Jesus' closest friends and their associates can write accurate biographies of him after a few decades. And keep in mind also that the culture of the first Christians was an oral culture. Hardly anyone could read, but they could tell stories by heart. Studies of ancient oral cultures have revealed that information can be passed down faithfully for generations in an oral culture. So a few decades is no big deal. Not to mention that these stories were told in the context of a large and growing community called the church. A number of the eyewitnesses were still alive as late as the early 50s who could verify the information that was passed down. And there was an entire community who would have become well-versed in these stories and would have been able to identify any inconsistencies between what had been passed down and what had been written in the Gospels. So Luke wrote his Gospel, then he wrote Acts as a sequel. That book contains second and first-hand accounts of events that took place between AD 30 and AD 57. The rest of the New Testament is made up of letters, mostly from Paul, written to churches and individuals all over the Mediterranean region. The earliest of Paul's letters was Galatians, which was written in about AD 49. And the last was 2 Timothy, written in AD 67, right before Paul died. So yes, the Gospels and the book of Acts reliably depict the events surrounding the life and ministry of Jesus. They were eyewitness testimony preserved orally for a few decades and then finally written down. The other books were correspondence between the leaders of the early church and those they led. By the standard of history, these are historically reliable documents that are unparalleled in any ancient documents anywhere. So we can depend on what they have to say about the history they record. But the question remains, do the copies we have today accurately represent the original texts? In other words, because we have copies of copies of copies, how do we know that things weren't changed since the books of the New Testament were first written? Well, one of the oldest complete copies of the New Testament is called the Codex Sinaiticus. It dates back to about AD 350. Now we have fragments, pieces that are older than that. The oldest is a piece of the Gospel of John dating back to somewhere between AD 100 and AD 150. But again, let's put this into perspective. The Bible of the ancient Greeks was Homer's Iliad. And it was written about 800 BC, but the only copies we have of it date back to AD 200 or 300. That is a gap of 1,000 years between the original document and the oldest copy we have. Meanwhile, the gap for the New Testament, only about 300 years. And that's a lot less if you think about the oldest fragments we have. So as far as ancient documents go, the Bible has the shortest gap of time between the oldest copy we still have and the writing of the original. The gap is smaller than any other ancient document that we study today. Critics are often concerned that errors might still have been made in copying the New Testament, or that, worse, maybe even some deliberate edits were made. And the honest answer is yes, errors and edits happen. But the good news is we know about them. We know what they are. There's a whole family tree of copies of the New Testament. When we compare older copies to newer copies or copies from different parts of the world, guess what? We figure out what the mistakes and edits were. And any good Bible these days will have notes in the margins telling you about these mistakes or edits. We know about them. They're not news. They're called textual variants, and biblical scholars have known about them for a very long time. All you have to do is look in the margin of your Bible, and it'll tell you what those are. Just to put your mind at ease, though, these variants do not have any impact on any major teaching of Christianity. You can rest assured that not only does the New Testament reliably report the events surrounding Jesus' life and ministry, the copy you hold in your hand is 99.5% a pure representation of the original writings of the first Christians. And that fuzzy 0.5% clearly marked in the margins of your Bible. Now, does all of this alone prove Christianity to be true? No. But this is one piece of many that can give us confidence in our faith. By the way, we should probably say one more thing about the Old Testament. We've demonstrated the reliability of the New Testament, and in his Gospel, Matthew records that Jesus said this: "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." So here we have Jesus in the reliable New Testament endorsing the Old Testament. So it follows that if we believe in the reliability of the New Testament, we should also believe in the reliability of the Old Testament. Now, that's not to say that we interpret them both the same way, but it does mean that the Old Testament is authoritative. But you might still be asking a question. What does it all have to do with us? Okay, so the Bible accurately communicates things that happened thousands of years ago. Fine, I can believe that. But why should we care? Why should it matter to us? Why should these stories be so important to us? That's what we'll be discussing next week.